We'll get started. I'll start with the media panel. We have Andrew McCarthy, who's contributing editor to the National Review. We have Michael Zeldin, who's the CNN legal analyst. We have Celeste Katz, senior political reporter. And we've got Sylvia at Glamour, I should add. And we've got Sylvia Davy, who's who's the contributing editor to equities.com. Andrew, why don't you jump in and share what have been some of your takeaways from the discussion so far?
Boy, I feel like having watched the first two panels that I had a lot more to learn than I had to contribute here. It was really remarkable. I guess I come at this from, as far as a media perspective is concerned, more as a former prosecutor than as a journalist, because that's what my training is. And I've always thought that in communicating, one of the jobs that we have as prosecutors is to try to take things that are complex and break them down both segmentally and thematically in a way that everyday lay people can understand them. And I'm sort of listening to all this, and particularly the commentary about what we're hearing from Washington. I'm hoping for just a comeback of civility and the idea that we can talk to each other even if we disagree with each other, if we can actually break things down, operate from the same set of facts, and then land on a theme. That's what we always tried to do as prosecutors, was land on a theme that even if you were involved in a fact matter or a fact pattern that seemed abstruse, that you would at least give people a hook or two hooks that they could wrap the facts around their brain as they came in. And I think that's the most important thing, to try to break it down so that people can understand it, but also give them a reason to want to understand it.
Great. And Michael Zeldin from CNN, your take?
Well, so let me say before I start speaking that I'm speaking on my own behalf. I am not speaking on behalf of CNN. Anything I say is attributable to me only, and not Turner Broadcasting Systems or CNN or any affiliate.
Slide this a little closer.
Do I need to make that disclaimer again? I am not. I am not speaking on behalf of CNN, just on behalf of myself. And I think that the thing that I took away is the weight comment by Cheryl. Why am I talking? So I'm going to excuse myself now from the panel because I'm not sure what I have to say. I expect that I'm waiting for your question and answer session, but I think the thing that I am struck with all along, being on TV each day and covering legal matters and the notion of the enemy of the press and the like, is that it seems to me that it's a bit blown out of proportion historically, that the times we live in now are not the worst of times. There have been many times that are far worse. And we can talk about, for example, Woodrow Wilson and his attack on the press in 1917, and the jailing of people who spoke out against conscription in World War I, and the prohibition of mailing socialist magazines, that the Postmaster General had the power to prohibit the mailing of socialist magazines because it was deemed to be against the best interests of the United States. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the liberal jurist, in upholding convictions of socialists who are speaking against conscription in World War I, comes up with the clear and present danger. You can't yell fire in a movie theater, which at its time seems progressive in a sense, but it was to uphold convictions of people who were speaking out against the war. So, I mean, the use of media and the attacks on media today, to me, are just cyclical. And I just take a deep breath when everyone says that. I think, all right, well, we're in that cycle. Let's not, sort of overplay it. We don't have a committee on public information, which was what we had in 1917. And George Creel told us what we could and couldn't think and say. And if you said it wrong, you go to jail. And they went to jail for a long time. Eugene Debs, 20 years for speaking. So my point of this principally is As bad as these times seem, if you take a historical point of view, they are just another cycle in the sort of cycle of history in respect of government and media relations.
That's a really thoughtful insight, and I guess everyone might have to take a step back from Overreactors Anonymous to just get a grip on what's going on. Celeste Katz, you're in an interesting role as a senior political reporter at Glamour. Why don't you share a little bit from what you've been hearing, how you filter that through what your responsibilities are?
Well, I think that one of the things I was thinking about listening to some of the earlier panels was this idea of trust in institutions. I cover politics, so specifically my interest in trusting government and political institutions, whether that's the White House, whether that's Congress, whether that's the Supreme Court, and so on. But I think that you can extrapolate that out a little bit to the idea of trust in relationships with, in terms of a reporting perspective, with businesses and with entities outside the government. So talking about the issue of access and message and who we are speaking with and what's being conveyed to us. I think that that this is a big picture issue that we're talking about that goes way beyond what I do. And I also think that a lot of the issue, perhaps for communicators and for reporters, is the issue of siloing. I think that you see, for example, I work for Glamour, and by the way, I am here as we've discussed, speaking on my own behalf, and my opinions are my own, and everything I say should be attributed to Michael Zeldin.
And Celeste.
So just want to make that disclaimer.
Yeah, Celeste, I should say that's a reminder that I should always have the attorneys speak first.
Yeah.
On that.
So I
memo
just
to
wanna-
As long
Sal.
as I get the Glamour spread that you promised.
Okay, well, we can follow up on that afterwards. But again, I mean, okay, so I write for, do not speak for, but I write for a women's magazine. Does that mean the issues that I'm talking about only are interesting to, only relate to women? I write a lot about voting. They're letting ladies vote now, I heard. I decided to check that out. Here, some of them are even running for office. But is that an issue that only concerns women? Yet when people go to seek out information, or when you decide, people in the communications industry decide where to go with that information, there is now, I think, a very, very prominent sense of siloing. As my father says, people read newspapers to confirm what they already think. So the idea that, well, I have to go to this outlet or that outlet to find a friendly audience, I think is kind of damaging to the idea of having a well-informed, well-rounded public. And I think that we try to do as much as we possibly can to combat that. But in this environment, especially, calling out the idea of calling out an inaccuracy or a discrepancy or a lie, because we use that word now, a lie, is not in itself a partisan act. It is not an act of self-expression, but it is widely perceived that way. And I think that's why we see a lot of people, whether it's on the communications side of business or on the government side or in politics or campaigns, you do see people hesitating. Because in the end, whether you're competing for customers or you're competing for voters, you don't want to alienate anyone who might be interested in you as you are playing to your established base.
Great, and Celeste, just as brought up when we were discussing diversity with the last panel, it's far more detailed and nuanced than we think. It's not just a homogenous group. For example, on the issue of Me Too, it wasn't all women agreeing that Me Too had gone too far or not too far. That was split among party lines in terms of what your perception was. In the last election, I believe 52% of white women voted for President Trump. So, we have to think, as we look at diversity, there are way more layers to it, if you will. Sylvia, why don't you take us from there, your perspective on what's been discussed so far?
Sure. I think, and I'll explain my perspective and where it comes from, but I think the three takeaways that I heard talked a lot about in the two previous panels are definitely authenticity, opportunity, and trust. And I think I definitely resonated with both of the panels because of my background. I've spent over 20 years on both sides of the equation. So having started my career here at Edelman in their corporate and financial communications practice with a very strong specialty in media, I went off into the corporate world and spent almost a decade overseeing the NASDAQ market site in Times Square and really establishing a media studio for a publicly traded exchange and working with all of their listed companies across many industry sectors. And then having gone into professional services and entertainment industry, and now more recently having been working with a number of different fintech organizations and primarily really helping raise awareness of how innovation is having an impact in our markets, and most recently also being a contributor to equities.com, which is an emerging growth innovation platform that covers companies from all industry sectors that are the next big thing, so that they're emerging. So I come at this from wearing both my communications hat and also my hat as a media expert and a contributor. And I could say that with the three elements that were brought up by all my other industry colleagues here, authenticity plays a major factor in how we communicate, whether you're a journalist, a media organization, or an organization. And I think at the end of the day, what's incredibly important is the fact that social media has played an increasing role in really how we're perceiving the news. And if you think back, I mean, media in general derives from the word medium. So it is a medium to inform the public. But at the end of the day, what the media ends up doing is also helping shape how we perceive the actual information. So from a media organizational standpoint, I think policies and rigorous standards have become even more important than ever before. I do agree with the panel. I think one of my colleagues here says is that if we look back at history, we've gone through these scenarios. There's been challenging attacks in the past on the media, but social media now has really blurred the lines. And I think it's really important to take a look at, what your philosophy is as a media organization. It's more important than ever to do those daily editorial meetings and to make sure that you have standards. And the large news organizations, for instance, are really reinforcing fact-checking more than ever. But at the end of the day, what really ends up happening in times like the ones we're in right now is that it does create an open door opportunity for brands to step in and to have a voice. So I think it's very interesting times that we're in. Social media, I think, is what's really making the difference in how we're perceiving the information today. And the only other thing I would add is from a reputational standpoint. That's one thing I didn't hear talked about a lot in the other panels, is that we all have a reputational challenge right now, and particularly in the media, because this concept of fake news is being used by everyone now. And so if we take a look at, and having my public relations background weigh in, how we actually manage our own corporate reputation as media entities, whether you're a large media organization or a smaller emerging growth focused platform, it really becomes important to take a stance and to have very pointed views on how you're going to tackle some of these social issues.
Great, thank you. And as my millennial kids would call it, hot takes, we have about 15 minutes left, so we'll try and get a lot of topics covered. So we might want to go with like sound bites. Plus, in these answers, Michael Zeldin, I noticed you were taking notes on that. Did you have thoughts on that? And then
I just wondered to myself about these words that we've been using of authenticity and transparency and what exactly that they mean. For me, the only word that matters in media and the transportation of ideas is truth. Are you telling the truth? Not whether you're saying whatever it is that you're saying in an authentic voice, or that you're being transparent in what you're doing, but rather are you telling the truth? And look, I grew up, I'll age myself, I grew up watching Walter Cronkite. And Walter Cronkite told us that's the way it is. That was the news, that was the facts. And then at the end of the news, Eric Sevareid gave us his opinion. Now, we don't have that distinction as clearly made. Facts are presented. I'm not here, if that's for me. There's a complete blurring, in my estimation, of opinion and fact, and that convergence and therefore inability to distinguish between the two makes truth-seeking much more complicated. So for me, you know, having spent 15 years as a consultant for a consulting firm, I know what government, what corporate speak is about transparency and authenticity and stuff. But I think we're really talking about truth-telling.
Yeah, and that's an interesting
else.
Insight based. I was speaking with Anthony Scaramucci, who was trying to be part of the panel this morning, but was traveling this morning, and he talked of transparency, but more in the context of the likelihood that truth would be discovered. And he talked about the Khashoggi awful situation and murder, and how years ago that might not have even been in the public sphere. It could have been kept within, but within, Apple Watch, that kind of information comes out.
Well, and since the massacre in Pittsburgh, on Instagram, it was reported in the New York Times yesterday, on Instagram, if you search for the word Jew, it would display 11,696 times the hashtags Jew did 9/11. So, I mean, the mechanism by which these social mediums allow people to provoke and incite is just, startling.
May I just say something about that, though? I agree with that. At the same time, I do think, and this goes back to Michael, to your first point, we have to get a little bit of a grip here on the environment we're in. News comes at us so fast now, and it seems, because of the media coverage situation is much different than it was even 20 years ago, that we're at each other's throats all the time, and everything in the country is torn apart, and everything in the country is polarized. When we were thinking about what to say about Pittsburgh at National Review in the last couple of days, I went back and did a little research. I prosecuted terrorism in the 1990s, so this is an area of some interest to me. In 1972, there were 1,900 bombings in the United States. If you look at the decade from 1970 to 1980 in terms of terrorism and terrorist events, it dwarfs what we're dealing with today, even though we've had quite a number of horrific incidents in terms of international terrorism. And the other thing I thought was interesting about that is in 1970, when we had this, Brian Burrow wrote a great book about this called Days of Rage, which is a history of the domestic terrorism in the 1970s. The interesting thing about this, or one interesting thing about it, is I look back, the population of the United States in 1970 was 205 million. Today, we're closer to 330 million. So the population of the nation has gone up more than 50%. Yet, if you look at it, we live in much more peaceful times. Our crime rates are much lower. The number of incidents we have are actually much lower. So I think, it does seem, everybody's always got to be careful about presentism and feeling like you're in the most polarized, most politicized, most awful period in the history of periods. But I think sometimes we have to take a deep breath and think about how lucky we are to live in this age. I mean, if you think about it just in terms of domestic tranquility, we're living in historically good times. So, maybe not so bad.
And in political tranquility. Ask John Adams what it was like to have Thomas Jefferson as his vice president in 1800.
He's actually going to be on the next panel.
Right. You couldn't get Aaron Burr as a...
It's over at the theater.
No, I was just thinking in response to a couple of things that were that were just mentioned, this idea of living in the present or immediacy. I think that immediacy plays into how the news cycle works and how people perceive it and how people navigate it in a couple of different ways. I mean, I worked for example, I spent most of my career, about 20 years, I started very young at about 5, so about 20 years in working for print newspapers, 2 print newspapers, the Providence Journal and the New York Daily News. And there were a couple of things about living in that environment and working in that environment and interacting with readers or / customers, as it may be for people here who are in the PR industry. There were certain newspapers that were widely available and widely read. They contained a selection of articles that were determined to be the most important news of the day. There was a cushion of time between the occurrence of the news event and the presentation of that event and the interpretation of that event to the public. The reaction that we received back, whether in the form of fan mail, I like to call it fan mail, but letters to the editor, phone call to you or to your editor, making some pleasant observations about your family heritage or your appearance, for example, that sort of thing. There was more of a cushion. Now, in the same day, I might get an enraged letter saying to me, for example, that quote unquote, I actually did get some letter like this. I mentioned it on social media myself, just to point out that this has been going on for a while after the Pittsburgh incident, referring to me, telling me from a reader that it would be wonderful to see more of you liberal, Marxist, Bolshevik Jews burned to a crisp in the oven. But I might get, well, hey, guy, as long as you're a reader, I'm thrilled. Thank you, thank you. Tell all your friends to keep buying, to keep clicking and keep buying. I appreciate your readership, but at the same time, I might get a very angry email, which I also got, about how can you write about those hate-mongering Republicans? You liberals are you conservative wackos don't know what you're doing to this country. How can you buy that line? we can have a fight for that reader after this panel. But so the idea is you get that reaction, both of those reactions. You could get both of those reactions immediately on the same day. You could even get that reaction to the same story. And so the idea that people are being sort of buffeted by this, there is not as much time to process either the news event or the reaction, and there's a big danger in that for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to run down the whole checklist, but the idea that news organizations know they will get this reaction, whether good or bad. Frankly, what it comes down to is traffic in a lot of senses. And that's why I also get concerned, and another big difference between working in print newspaper, daily print newspaper environment, and working in, say, either a monthly magazine or digital space. I also do work in radio, where somebody will call you up literally on the phone, and you can have that argument on the phone, which I love also, because you could just have it out there and you can be done with it. But the difference is, there is an understanding that while these things are very emotional and very disturbing, people enjoy reading them. People like to make things personal. Rants sell. Okay, back when
Hollywood sells entertainment factor stuff
exactly,
too, right?
Exactly.
So the role of the celebrity has now become more critical in having a voice. And quite frankly, and just to echo, a lot of what you're saying, and this is the area of opportunity that I mentioned is out there for corporations and for brands, right? Because the media itself now has to react in real time to those comments, and it's impacting how they're, focusing on the next story and fact checking. I mean, there was even an article in today's New York Times that even talked about how social media has now created all this misinformation on the caravan coming in from Honduras over to Mexico, and old images that are not even accurate are being pushed out on social media and reproduced. And then there was a comment that was made about Middle Eastern terrorists coming in with the caravan. So you have all of these new elements that the social media component has now added, and a journalist has to, of course, always check her own social media channels and make disclaimers for compliance purposes. But at the end of the day, you know, that has left the door wide open for a lot of organizations, and particularly brands, right? And we talked about that a lot in the earlier panel. And there's three ways of looking at how organizations are going to address it. That there's whether you're a B2B, a B2C, and a publicly traded organization, right? They all have different implications. And then there's, of course, a nonprofit where, you know, social purpose has become so incredibly important to millennials. And you know, I read recently that I think 66% of consumers want brands to take a stance. But if you're a publicly traded organization, you're going to definitely think about the implications of your stakeholders and if your board's going to approve. And then there's certain CEOs that feel very passionate and very specific about filling a void that the media is not going to go take the risk and have a stance on, right? So you have all these new implications, and I think, again, it creates opportunities. I think from a communication standpoint, I think it's just incredibly important to embed it in your overall business strategy. Really, you know, having a look at what your CEO feels passionate about, how the entire executive management team feels it will impact all of its stakeholders, whether it's board or its employees or its customers, and if they're going to take a stance, and then just be consistent about the communication. And then lastly, from a media standpoint, I think, you know, very responsible media organizations have been doing this for decades. They have rigorous policies. They do their fact checking. They have editors checking their work. I think, you know, that's the role that the media has played. And then there's smaller media outlets like equities.com, for instance, that doesn't have a huge editorial staff but relies very heavily on their contributors and really taking a look at making sure that some of the content is not too self-serving or too partisan. And so just having an actual strategy, an editorial strategy, or, you know, having a business strategy if you're a corporation is really the opportunity and the only thing we can do during these very dynamic times of change.
Well, can I add something?
Michael, why don't you jump in?
I think maybe I'm a Luddite, and I feel in some sense like I'm talking to people in historical terms. I'm talking about the Wobblies and the Sedition Act of 1917 and Wilson and the Committee on Public Information. I don't mean to live in that times. And the Luddites were those who, during the Industrial Revolution, would destroy the machinery rather than let the industrial take over the agricultural. So I'm a Luddite. I don't like change. But here's an idea. I don't tweet. I don't use Instagram. I don't use Snapchat. On Facebook, which I've had because my kids set it up for me 20 years ago, occasionally I'll post a Monty Python skit or traveling Wilburys after Tom Petty passed away. I don't use it to communicate ideas because of what you said. I don't want to have a conversation, whether it's eyeballs or on my CNN.com articles or not. I don't want to have that. I don't want to have that incendiary conversation. I don't see any value in legitimate communication over Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, or any of those things, because they are spur of the moment, you know, sort of top of your head ramblings. It's sort of like when you're mad, they say, before you send that email when you're mad, put it in draft, park, come back to it an hour later and see if you still want to say it. And oftentimes you look at it and think, oh my God, and you don't say it. Instagram and Snapchat and all those things don't let you do that. It is just pure vitriol most of the time that comes straight out of your bowels. And I don't think that that's a valuable mechanism for especially journalists to be communicating. As I say, I speak on behalf of myself and no media organization.
No, I just wanted to respond to that very quickly because I think that's an interesting point, and I think that it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. Maybe this is the difference between authenticity and accuracy. Okay, we all have a responsibility to report news accurately. Authenticity is, I think, to me, sort of more of a personal approach. Now, I certainly do not advise responding to every wacky one-off angry person who tweets at you, saying things that I certainly will not say here on camera, and things I certainly would not say to my mother. But there is that, and there is sometimes that urge to say, hey, I'm not a liar, I'm not a shill for, I'm not this, I'm not that. It's like I'll come back to you and we can talk about it, and I'll help you with the big words if you get a little emotional, and that's fine. But I think that one thing that it does foster, in some cases, a thought-out response can have the same effect as responding to a reader's letter or a reader's phone call, which is to make people understand in real terms that we are not some sort of, the fourth estate is not some sort of removed, uncaring, unlistening, unfeeling, uninterested entity that does not know, that expects people to consume what we put out, but does not care whether we, whether they understand it, whether it fits their needs, whether it answers their questions, whether it gives them useful information, whether they think it's right or wrong. So I think that in some cases, I'm not advocating for establishing a digital footprint or having a back and forth with somebody just for its own sake, but I do think that in cases where it's appropriate, I do think it has a purpose, and I do think that it establishes, some measure of trust, if not agreement, between the person providing the information and the people who are reading it.
Awesome, and I'm going to give Andrew a chance for the final word on this. First, I want to say we've covered a tremendous amount of ground. We've established that things not only aren't terrible, they may be better than they've ever been. However, and this is an important however, the perception of how things are might be worse than ever. And this is really a challenge for us as communicators to navigate on behalf of our organizations and our clients. So Andrew, if you want to give us your final takeaway in all that we've heard today, go for it.
Well, I think the two most important words I've heard here are standards and truth. There's an immediacy about the way that things come at us now because of the way the media is. I hear what Michael is saying about social media. On the other hand, it's a fact. It exists, it's there, it's the way people consume news, and it's the way that news is shaped before it ever gets out in the traditional ways we know of it. So it seems to me, to my mind, you don't really have a choice. You have to sort of be out there and try to influence that. So I think the most important things are you have to have standards and you have to have truth be the top standard. And people have very strong political feelings. I have very strong political feelings. But the one thing I learned 20 years in the courtroom is if you don't have the facts right, your case gets laughed out of court. Doesn't matter if you're a liberal or a conservative. What people want to know when they have to make an important decision is what's the truth? What are the facts? So I think you want to make sure you vet that as soon as things come across the transom, because they come across the transom real fast now.
Great. Awesome panel. Thank you, guys. Thanks to our audience watching online and through social media, our crew and our sponsors. We'll see you at our next event. Thanks so much.